Hello, everyone. My name is Godswill Umokoro. I'm a web developer from Lagos, Nigeria. Nigeria is a country in Africa, in case you're wondering. And with me here is Ryan Burgess. Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Coswell, for having me too. I'm excited to just have a chat with you and talk about career growth as a software engineer. So right now I'm a software engineering manager at Netflix. I lead two teams in our productivity engineering org, I guess you could say. And we're focused really on building out tools and infrastructure for the rest of our engineers across the company to make them more productive. So it's really just to unblock and make sure that we're building the right infrastructure for folks to build the great Netflix experience that you are all used to using if you are a Netflix subscriber.
Wow, that's awesome. So I'd like us to start with a couple of questions that code newbies like me, myself, might have. The first question I'd like to start with is who is a software engineer? Because we've been hearing that term, software engineer. Like, what does it mean to be a software engineer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I got a similar question the other day too, from especially around like the web front end, all these different terms that get thrown out. Is a developer the same as front end, as same as an engineer? Is there differences? And or like UI developer, front ends, like are there differences? And to me, they're pretty much all the same. Others may argue differently, but to me, like you're describing that you are building some sort of software. If it's UI front end, you're building things that people are seeing and interacting with versus, something that's more like a backend engineer is building backend infrastructure, APIs, whatever that may be, that maybe isn't as visible to the end user, but there is the UI interacting with it. So I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting at, but that was like a whole lot of terms even added on to your question.
Yeah, and this is one thing that gets people like so confused about the craft and the job because there are so many terminologies and different uh, different paths to being a software engineer. So I guess I should refine my question a little bit in terms of like what are the different career choices that are available for software engineers.
Oh, that's a loaded question too. I mean, there's lots. I mean, there's I think about it is you can be very specialized, and that might be in defining someone being like a front end engineer. Maybe that's specialized, but I even think further down in that, even just in your like sphere of front end, you can be super specialized in like performance or accessibility or just JavaScript in general for the UI or I'm trying to think of like even just the HTML, CSS. Like there's all these different things that people can specialize even within the realm of front end or back end. Like there's all different forms of things that you can be focused on. And so I think you can specialize in these, even just the world in which back end or front end or infrastructure, whatever it may be. But then there's even layers that you can specialize even deeper in that. Or you can be a little more jack of all trades or a full stack engineer where you're kind of working up and down the stack. You're doing a little back end, you're doing some front end, maybe you're doing some performance work. Like there's different things in which you're doing on a daily basis that you're familiar with. So I think there's different things that you can do. And I think in a career, I don't think you necessarily have to pick one. I think it's really great to have experience working on the back end or experience working on the front end, even if you chose to be like, say you're wanting to be a front end engineer, but you've also worked on the back end. I think that ends up helping you, even if you specialize in the front end. You work really strong and collaborate with other engineers that may be back end engineers, but you have a better understanding what they're doing and how you can interact with them, how you can communicate through an API. So there's a lot of benefits, I think, to having exposure to different areas of the stack, but it's also okay to completely specialize and really focus and own your craft.
Wow, that's awesome. Thanks for um diving into that very broad topic. All right, so the next question I'd like to ask is looking at the perspective of a beginner or a newbie, a code newbie, like how can someone who wants to become a software engineer begin their journey? How can they start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we live in an amazing time for software engineering in general. Is there's so many amazing resources available to us. Whether, obviously online, there's just so many great tools, whether it be YouTube videos, blog posts, tutorials, there's even things that like these are a lot of those are free, but then even just like paid work, boot camps or paid like online resources. There's all these amazing tools available to us to learn, and I think that it gets at everyone and how they like to learn too. You can even reach out to people like and asking them questions. Twitter, great space to be in to talk and communicate about different things and learn. But I think back to even when I first started, and this will date me, like, I mean, I've spent most of my career as a front end engineer, but like even then, that term that wasn't a thing. Like front end wasn't really a thing. That's kind of grown since I started, and there weren't a lot of resources. Like there were like forums and things like that that you could maybe learn from, but it wasn't as easy to just like Google something and get a really great answer or a like video tutorial on like what you're trying to do. So I think we're in a world where it's like you can get exposure to a lot of things, but sometimes that's difficult too because what's the right thing that you want to be what's the right thing that you want to be exposed to? Sometimes it's hard because there's so many things that you could be learning and it can be overwhelming.
Yeah, that's true. And I've actually personally faced or encountered everything you're saying right now. It gets really, really overwhelming, even though there are like a million resources out there. Awesome. The next question
Yeah,
I want
and I was
to
gonna
go
add
ahead.
too is I think that's when too is it's like connecting with others too, like networking and just being able to ask other people's thoughts, like especially someone who's further along in their career, you can kind of get some input on that. And I think it's worth asking multiple people because my opinion's probably going to be different from the next person's because we all learn differently. But I think even just asking people how they've learned or resources they've found useful can be very beneficial too.
That's true. And you sort of touched the next question I was about to ask.
Nice.
Because the next question was supposed to be, what are some advice that you'd like to give to someone who's just learning to code? What are some advice you'd like to give? And of course, you've given a couple already. Would you like to add to it, or it's fine?
Yeah, no, I think that's really specific too. Um, I think not to get discouraged or get too hung up on what everyone else is doing or what everyone else knows. Because I think no matter what I've learned in my career, is someone's always going to know something more than you or just be, have more depth on a certain subject. And that's awesome. You're going to bring depth to another piece or subject that they may not know. So I think like not getting too hung up on what everyone else knows or like comparing yourself is really important. Another thing I always recommend too is build something. This is my personal learning style. I can't read a textbook or, I mean, I can, but like I'm not going to learn as much just reading about it, and I need to apply it. And so I think people also get hung up, or I've had, run into this where people get hung up on um, how should I like, learn this piece of technology? Like, oh, I could build like a Twitter app or I could build a to-do app, but there's like a million of those. And like, why would I recreate something? Well, it's not so much that you're recreating something to like put out there into production, it's like a great way to learn. Like creating a social network or even the to-do app is always like go to. You're learning a lot of things in which like how to create something and you're trying to solve a problem. And I think to me that's like practical. Like I really need to when I'm trying to figure out a new technology, I need to just do something. I need to build something small, even if I never finish it. it's like I just kind of get through the patterns and learn that really well. And that's not it for everyone, but I found that for a lot of people that goes a long way.
That's awesome. And I just want to ask a little question in addition to what you just said. So, say for example, I want to build a Twitter app. As an example, would you recommend me following a tutorial that shows me how to build specifically a Twitter app, or should I follow a more general purpose tutorial on, say, Node.js or React, and then use whatever I'm learning to build the app on my own?
Whew, that's a good question. I think it depends. Like I'm trying to
Okay.
think like if you know your outcome, like you're like, and there's a great tutorial showing you all that, and you have a bit of knowledge on something like React, maybe it's just fine to follow that tutorial. Maybe it's a mix of both too. Like there might be things that the tutorial kind of just like glasses over, kind of just like doesn't really go in depth on that. You're like, wow, I don't really know what, you know, creating this component actually looks like. And so maybe I have to do some follow-up research. But I think that in like when you're creating something, I think it's that like push that you need to follow up research is what helps me is like, oh, well, how do I do like, a post back to like a database? It's like that could be just something I'm trying to figure out in that moment. And that might be some Google searches and maybe I find a tutorial that's on that. And I think that I don't know, I'm not really answering the question. I think it's like a mix. I don't think it's a one size will solve your problem.
I think that's the best answer anyone can give, and that's true. So building project is great. Building project is awesome. You learn it during the process, but realistically, we all get stuck, especially as beginners. What would you say? What would you advise newbies to do when they get stuck building the project?
Walk away from it. Like not ditch it completely, but I have made so many mistakes where I've sat like for on a problem for way too long without sometimes even just like taking a 10-minute break or a walk away from it can sometimes help a lot. Obviously, it's not going to magically solve itself, but sometimes just getting like walking away from it can really help bring a fresh perspective back to it. But there's other things like lean on others, like ask questions, get comfortable asking questions of peers or someone on Twitter or on GitHub or wherever you're like comfortable doing that. I think more often than not, at least I've personally have even in the past been scared to ask the questions, like in fear that, I'm going to get shamed for not knowing something or um, any of that. Like it's hard to ask questions, but I think like once you can kind of get comfortable doing that, like there's a lot of amazing people out there that are just willing to help. And I think that to me, I love our community for that because I see a lot of that. And I wish that I even did more of that when I first started. Granted, there wasn't, like I said, the community wasn't massive as it is today. And so that's a resource that I think people should take advantage of.
Yeah, you're right. You're right about asking questions. You're right about everything. But I just want to talk about, the point about asking questions because I mean, I asked for this space, from you, and you were like so open about it. You were like, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." So positive about it. I have asked some other people, for collaborations and something like this, but the response from some people have been like, "Nah," or some wouldn't even reply me. So I guess the point I'm taking from this is, don't focus on the people who don't answer your question or don't have the time or the attention. Don't give you the attention because there are other people who are actually like willing to help, just like you are in this case.
Absolutely. And I think it's not that the other person may not be that they're not willing or yeah, I mean some people say, "Hey, sorry, no," which is fine. Like
Fine.
I'm sure that I know that I miss a lot of messages. Like you can't respond to everything, right? Like it's,
Yeah.
but there's likely so if that person didn't respond, try someone else. Like eventually someone's gonna help. And usually I'm hopeful that your responses people weren't like rude. They're not like, why are you bugging me? It's more like, no, thanks, appreciate it, but no, I'm busy or whatever it is. Usually it's pretty nice. Like people are usually fairly friendly.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. You're right. You're right about that. So now let's clear up some misconceptions with regard to software engineers. Do you need to become good at math or science to learn how to code?
I'm sure it helps and everything, but do you have to be amazing at it? No, I don't believe that at all. Um, I didn't apply myself very much in math or science in school, and somehow I figured it out. So, but I'm sure like I could be better. I'm sure I would have made my life easier by just knowing more of it, but I do not believe you need to, be like a mathematician or be really strong at math or science. I didn't take computer science. That's a perfect example. I wish I did. There's things that I go back and forth. There's times when I like wish that I had taken a computer science degree, but there's other times where I'm like, well, I mean, I've survived without it. But there's ways in which I would have learned some of the concepts a little bit easier if I would have just had more dedicated time. I feel like I've had to go back in my, in time and kind of like figure some things out and teach myself some of the fundamentals that I may have learned in a CS program.
Mm, that's true. I mean, I studied computer science in school. Not that I'm proud about it, but because I'm still learning how to code right now.
But you're never done.
But
That's the thing too, is like even if I had done it, like even what I know today, I'm still learning. Like you're always constantly learning, and I think that's exciting, right? Like you're never going to be like the best at it because there's always so much more to learn, and I think that to me is exciting because it keeps things fresh and you're constantly getting better.
absolutely. Should code newbies stick with one learning resource or think around?
Um, I would say don't stick with one resource. I mean, I'm sure there's some great resources that you learn a lot in just one piece of it, but I think even just our conversation now is there's a lot of depends, right? Like there's a lot of you're learning different things different ways and nobody knows all the answers. And so if you're like, yeah, this one person that does React, like they know everything about React, they don't, or they just know React but they don't know all these other things that you may want to learn. And so I think like you're getting different perspectives too, and I think hearing different people's perspectives and how they approach a problem, you're learning too, and you're starting to find and see different ways in which the same problem can be solved but just in a different way. So I think multiple resources is a good idea.
Okay, and I think that also answers my next question, but I'll say ask it anyway, just in case you want to chip in something. What's the best learning style? Video formats, text-based, books, docs, documentations,
Totally
specs.
individual. Like I think that's totally individual. For me, there's ways in which I learn could be like even depending what else I'm trying to do, right? Like sometimes reading a blog post can be really great. Like if you're not wanting to like listen to a video, like maybe your kids are asleep and you're like, oh, I just want to read a blog post. This can be really useful. Or there's been times where like I find I can listen to audio. I used to read a lot more, but I find like audiobooks are really key for me right now. Not programming books, so like I can't learn like through audiobooks on
Of
programming.
course.
I'll just put that out there. These are more like maybe like leadership books or things that I'm paying attention to. But I find like I can multitask like by listening to that, maybe cleaning the house, doing dishes, whatever it is. And so I think it's like everyone has their way in which like works for them. And I think that's the beauty of it. We have all these great resources that kind of help you through that. There's a video, there's a blog post, there's a podcast, there's an audiobook, there's a book. Like there's so many different ways in which to learn. I think it's very individual.
That's true. Now let's get to documentations. Whether you love reading or not, we would all agree that documentations are very important. Especially when learning to code and when building applications. What advice would you give to someone who's finding it hard to read documentations or finding it hard to understand them?
Hmm. Good. That's a great question. I have so many feelings on documentation, like in general. You there's a lot of bad documentation. Let's just put that out there. Let's start there. There's a
Okay.
lot of really bad documentation on things because I think we often, and I'm guilty of this, like I'll build something and I throw it out to the world. Like the building the, whether it be a tool or who knows what I've built or a component, it's like you know how it works and it's working great and you did what you wanted it to do. I often find like the documentation is like the afterthought, even though it's so important for others to be able to like leverage what you've built. You're happy, you built what you were achieved, went to build, and like oftentimes the documentation gets like kind of as an afterthought. Um, or another piece that bothers me about documentation too is it gets out of date really quickly. If it's not being updated and thought through like on a regular basis, it gets out of date so quickly. And so that can be frustrating too for someone reading your documentation is you're like, yeah, do X, Y, and Z, and but then they try and go do that, and there's like a dependency that's changed, but it didn't get updated. There's all these things that can be really frustrating. And we're seeing more and more tools that kind of help documentation, but it's still not perfect. And then to your more, I kind of went off a bit of a tangent there, but
Mm-hmm.
coming back to your question of like what happens if you don't understand something in documentation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm trying to think like of a good example. Like if there was something that like maybe a concept that you don't quite know, or it's like telling you to go use a library, or something that you can install and you don't really quite understand it. I think it's like gives you the opportunity then to kind of go research that thing. Like it's kind of like a stepping function to go learn something different, right? Like if it's like, oh yeah, use npm to install, and you're like, what the hell is npm? And you're like, oh okay, like you can kind of go down this rabbit hole. And I think to me, like being curious and wanting to go down those rabbit holes can be really useful. That to me is, I guess, the best advice. I don't, I'm trying to think of a good example of like what you wouldn't understand in documentation. Sometimes if it was like literally with something that someone's created, ask them, like comments, like if it's in like a GitHub repo, maybe it's like create an issue or ask a question. Reach out to the maintainers. There's ways in which like I think you can get back to that, like it's okay to ask a question, and you may be even helping them because like maybe their documentation wasn't very good, or maybe now you can add to their documentation to make it more clear.
My gosh, that's so cool. That's so true. Recently I was playing around with AWS Lightsail, and I was trying to host a LAMP stack project, PHP.
Mhm.
People say PHP is dead. I don't
It's
think
not
it's
dead.
dead.
It's used so much. Like, yeah, it's everywhere.
So on Lightsail, they make it sort of mandatory to host your LAMP stack projects on Bitnami, which is like just like a configuration of Apache, MySQL, and everything you need. And now Bitnami's documentation for Lightsail wasn't really that comprehensive, and I was finding it hard. I was looking for some stuff, like the host name and some other um, information I would need, for my app. And I was finding it hard to find those credentials I was looking for. And I tweeted, I was like, "Yo, you guys, what's up with your documentation?" And they responded to my tweet, which I was sort of like um, um, surprised that he responded to my tweet. They were like, "Oh, okay, we'll get back to the team and work on our documentation." And I was like, "Wow, that's cool. That's really really great." You know. And I
Yeah,
also
that's
plan
and that's
on
helpful for them
writing.
too, right? Like, because they want you to use like they've put it out there. They want you to use it, and so getting that feedback from someone who's actually trying to use it can be really helpful.
Exactly. How many hours should I spend on learning to code?
Oh man, that's such a that's such a tough question. Um, a healthy amount, like don't kill yourself. Like I mean you could spend infinite amount of time learning, and I think like setting time and setting goals for yourself I think can be helpful. Like what are you trying to achieve, and start to maybe take a step back and plan like what will that take to get to learn a framework or whatever you're trying to do, and kind of like chunk the work, like break it up into like what you're trying to do and what's realistic. I think sometimes like rather than just being like, because I mean it's endless. You could learn forever, but take it at your own pace. Like I think there again, don't get hung up on what everyone else is doing.
Gosh, I want to spend 20 hours a day learning to code so that I can be as good as Ryan Burgess.
Man, I'm probably not very good anymore. I spend most of my day in meetings, so you're good to go on that.
Okay, is jQuery dead? I want to hear it directly from Ryan Burgess.
Oh, I mean, I don't know how to answer this without, pissing off someone. Um, I don't I don't think it's dead. It's still used. Like you'll still come across places that use it. it it solved a like ton of problems. We all hate on jQuery, but like jQuery did so many amazing things. Like I feel like it really brought JavaScript to the forefront in the sense that like when I first started out, jQuery didn't exist, but like JavaScript was frustrating because um, you couldn't really support cross browser. I mean, you could. It was just really a lot of work to support cross browsers. Like there was always these nuances, and where something like jQuery just made it a lot easier. That abstracted that from you. It made things a lot easier for you to build something, and it, for the most part, worked across all the browsers. And so I think like there are still reasons to that people will reach to jQuery. Maybe the team's very familiar with it and they're productive and they're shipping what they need to ship. So I don't think it's dead. I don't think anything's ever dead. Our community on Twitter, we're all guilty for it. We pick on the things and like we're all hating on like what we used to do and like we got to be on the latest and greatest. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, what are you trying to achieve? And if it's solving your problem and it's working for you, I don't think it's dead. I mean, there are technologies that do actually get end of life. Not to say that you can't figure out how to still use them, but the support's obviously not there and like things will start to become like where they're not compatible. But long and short on this one, I don't think it's dead. Would I jump to use jQuery? Probably not. I haven't found a use case for it in many years because we've evolved and there's better ways in which to solve those problems.
Hmm, that's really dope. So we're done asking the questions that newbies would like to ask, and now I want to move over to aspiring junior developers. So it's going to be like in three parts: newbies, junior developers, and senior developers. So for this segment now, the first question I'd like to ask is, what's the minimum that I should learn before I can start searching for jobs?
Hmm, that's a good question. This will probably still vary by person, but I think when you start feeling fairly confident, you know what you're doing enough to be dangerous. Like you're never going to be know all the things. But if you feel confident that you are, building software and feeling like, yeah, I know what I'm doing, I still have a ton to learn, start applying. Like don't wait to be perfect or wait to know all the things or just, be able to do everything because you'll learn that as you go. And the first job, I will say, is really, really hard to land. It's like probably one of the hardest things because most jobs, they want someone with experience. That's what they're hiring for. And that's like a bulk of them. And getting that first job is key. You do that, now you have experience. It's changes the world of opportunity right there. So I think about it is start applying. It will be frustrating because it's, hard to find the first one. You will likely get turned down and like you may, but that's okay. I look at it too as get feedback. It still sucks like hearing no, I'm not gonna lie, that is kind of always feels shitty. But if you can, interview and do a technical interview with other engineers in the industry, and even if you bomb it, hopefully you learn something from it and that they're able to give you some feedback on the code that you've produced. And I think that's a good learning opportunity. But you also want to feel like you're in a good enough place to do that too, if that makes sense. Another thing I always recommend is like try and point people to things that you've created, especially when you're trying to land that first job, because you don't have the experience. So you want to say like, hey, here's a project on GitHub, like that I've built. And this is my code, and just trying to get people to show that you've done something.
Hmm, that makes perfect sense. Where can I search for jobs?
Where can you search for jobs? That's a good one too. Hey, Twitter seems to like I feel like everyone posts their job postings, which are great. In the past, I've used things like Indeed is kind of like I don't know how there's probably quite a few of those types where they it's like an aggregate of jobs. LinkedIn is good. One thing I have also found useful, it's a little like more time consuming, but it can be benefit in some ways too, is think of places that you may want to work and that they're doing something really cool, or you're like, I picture myself that I would love to work there, or find out more about them. Sometimes just like going to that point of like networking or reaching out to people, and you're not asking them for a job, or I would suggest avoid that. Like if you're just wanting to learn a bit more, but connect with them, like talk to them like through Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever it is, and say like, hey, would you have 30 minutes to like do a call? Like I would love to kind of hear more about the work that you're doing and learn about it. Now you're kind of networking too, right? And then like maybe they do have open positions, like you can kind of get to that. It's a little bit slower than just like applying, but you've also connected with someone, and maybe you learn more too, is like about their day to day and like what they're doing, and maybe it's the right kind of work that you want to do, or maybe it's not.
Hmm.
I think
What i-
sometimes we forget that. Like I think that like we think that it's like, yeah, just start applying everywhere. It works, but like that's one way. I think there's other ways too.
you're right. What is the job role of a junior software engineer?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I
It
mean, for
seems
the
like I'm
most
stressing you out with all these questions.
No, no, I mean, because they're just like broad questions. Like I think it's like hard to define. Like even when we get to the senior section, like everyone's always like, well, "What's a senior engineer?" I'm always like, "Yeah, that's really hard to define." Like it's like because a lot of people are like, "Oh, you have to have X amount of years of experience." I'm like, "Do you?" Like, anyways, another tangent. Yeah, for the junior aspect, like, I mean, when I started my career, I remember doing just a like a mix of different things. I even had started doing an internship and then got hired. But like I was kind of just doing anything that I could and working really closely with some of the more senior people. And that was awesome. So I was creating features, probably not as good or slower than the other engineers, but I absolutely had tasks, and I was, actually producing something that would get shipped to production. And so you are like adding to the team, and you're a team player in that sense. You just might not have it as complicated as pieces, or hopefully like you're not given the most complicated thing. But then hopefully you also have peers to work with that you can learn from, and lean on them for questions and everything. But I think to me, you're still doing the job in which someone who's very senior is doing. You're just maybe taking different types of features that you're creating. Um, but I don't think you're like having to go get people coffee or anything. Like you're actually doing the job that you want to be doing.
Hmm. Okay, that's really cool. For some of us who don't live in the U.S. or in Europe, for example, and would love to work in a dream company, say for example, that exists in the U.S., but we are somehow restricted by, say, company
Mhm.
or country employment laws. What can such people do? Um, what can they do for themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for anyone listening, I'm not from the US. I mean, I moved from Canada, and so I moved for work. And so I went through some of the processes of like getting a company to sponsor me for a visa. So they, because you need a visa in order to work if you're not a citizen or have a green card. So that's definitely an option, is like a lot of companies will sponsor people, but there's stipulations to that too. Different countries coming to the U.S. have different ways in which you can get a visa. Like like there's all these like legal things that, like, we have immigration lawyers that deal with that kind of stuff at Netflix. Um, so there's that. We also have this beauty of being remote. More and more companies are open to hiring people remote, and that to me is a great way too. Is that you don't even necessarily have to like move or be in another country. is sometimes an option. But even sometimes that's not an option because the company can't hire certain people, or not people, but like certain countries, like locations. Sometimes they have stipulations through taxes or other reasons, government reasons, that they can't hire certain people in certain countries. And so that might be, I've even seen where people have moved to like Europe or they've moved to Canada to like then be able to work for this said company in the US. Like there's just a lot of unique like options out there. And so long and short on this is like if you want to work for a company, talk to them. Try and figure
Hmm.
that out. Like what does it look like? There might be like maybe you hit the complete wall that is just not an option. But like at least you know that, and at least you know maybe some options in which it might be possible. But I think that we shouldn't be hesitant, like, oh, I can't go work at that place because they're in the US or they're in Europe or wherever. It's like, I mean, maybe moving isn't an option. That's, could be a barrier, but maybe they offer remote or there's other options.
Wow, that's such a compact answer. Thanks. I'm sure a couple of us are taking notes, me included. Next question is about data structures and algorithm. How much knowledge on data structures and algorithm sufficient to apply for the role of a junior software engineer?
Sorry, say that one again.
How much data structures and algorithms is sufficient to apply for the role of a junior software engineer?
I love that question. I don't know what the greatest answer for this one is either, because companies, I feel like a lot of companies ask the like data structures, algorithm questions for the interview. I don't agree with it that much either. Like I feel like it's better to ask questions that really apply to the certain role. I have definitely done many, data structures or algorithm questions on a whiteboard where I've got engineers that are at the company staring at me from behind and judging my code and my sloppy writing on the whiteboard. And it stresses the shit out of me. Like it's so stressful. So one, I'm probably only performing at like half like what I should be, but then also there there are questions that as a front end engineer, like a lot of them, I'm like, yeah, you deal with data structures and everything, but like algorithms kind of like not really something you're dealing with on a daily basis. And so there are ways in which, like I always suggest, if you're going into the interviews and you know you're going to be asked this, there are a lot of resources online to study for them. Just like go study and learn that. I even do that now. Like if I was to go interview again, like I'm like basically brush up on those data structures and algorithm questions just to be a little more prepared for it. I don't agree with it, like in the sense that, like, especially like when we're talking like front end, I'm like, a lot of the questions that I will ask, even in our interviews at Netflix, I try and ask like relative questions that, yeah, I'm going to talk about like what happens if you have to, let's create a component together of like a search component or whatever like it is, a list component. Like let's talk about that and actually build that together. And how would you approach that? And like, but I want it to be more practical to like what you're actually going to be doing on the job. Um, but not all companies are doing that. So study it, learn it. I think you don't have to know it all, but you want to feel comfortable enough to be able to perform on that whiteboard, or hopefully it's not the whiteboard, but I've even done it in Google Docs. Like seriously, live coding in a Google Doc. I
For real?
can't remember which company asked me to do that, but I was like, "Are you serious?" Like that was hard. It was awkward.
That's crazy. I'm actually mentoring someone who's learning how to code, HTML, CSS. And yesterday she asked if she could write our code in something like Microsoft Word, and I was just like, well, you can, but it's not built for that. You need a text editor to write code. And so you mentioned in Google Docs for your data structures and algorithm questions just like reminded me of that question that my mentee asked me, and it's so funny, so
Yeah.
funny.
So apparently you can write code in anything, right?
Apparently, yeah. I know we've talked about math not being very, very important, but when it comes to data structures and algorithms, do you think it's okay? Let's put it this way: how much math do you need to become good with data structures and algorithms?
I think sometimes in the algo side, like, I mean, and that's another thing, maybe going back to the interview thing too, is like, you know how I said, like, it's not really practical to ask those types of questions on the interview. I think if you're like, we have teams at Netflix that write algos, like, that is what they do on a daily, like on their daily basis. They're living and breathing algorithms. I'm pretty confident that if you're applying to that team, you're going to be getting asked those technical questions around, data structures, algorithms. Um, I think math, like, there again, like anything that like if you're strong at math, there's a lot of things that you're bringing to the table. In learning that, do you have to be like, I don't know what the level of math is. Like you failed math or you got A plus. I don't know. I think it really depends. It can never hurt to have a lot of additional knowledge. Like who knows? Like even something like maybe being an English major could be really helpful. Like it's really hard to know how that applies when you're building some of these things, but it can't hurt. But is it like a have to have? No, probably not.
Okay, and I mean I've tried studying data structures and algorithms in the past, and at some point I got to ask myself, I was like, how does this stuff I'm learning, how does it like how do I get to use it in a real life scenario, in a real life work environment? How do I apply all this stuff I'm learning? Um, During your career, have you actually had experiences where you have to apply, what you learned when you were studying data structures and algorithm in your real life working experience? Yeah.
Yes, it comes up and it is useful to know. It's sometimes hard to know when you're even like when it's coming up. Like there's because you're dealing like even, building a front end on the web, you're still dealing with data structures. Like that is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with data and you're manipulating or, showcasing it to the browser or whatever type of application you're creating. So you are dealing with it and sometimes you don't even really think of it that way.
Mm.
um, it helps, but there again, going deep on it, like oftentimes I felt like, getting to that practical or like, how am I applying this? Oftentimes I feel like when I've gone deep on that stuff, where I was applying it was the interview. And that's where I kind of struggle with it a bit too, is like I know it helps me in what I'm trying to produce, but I think the more like where I'm applying the most of it is literally in those technical interviews.
Mm, makes sense.
It's not a
What
waste of
advice?
time to learn it, though. It is not.
I know. What advice would you give to a junior software engineer who's currently working?
um, I mean, try and learn as much as you can from your peers. Try different things. Like, be open to, working with different technologies. Like, if the company wants to use something different, or maybe it's working full stack, is getting exposed to that kind of stuff can be really helpful. It can be stressful too, but it can be helpful to even help you longer in your career I mean, to maybe specialize. Like maybe it will just expose you to something that you end up following and falling in like in love with. Like I thought when I first started and wanted to do what I'm doing now is I started out thinking I wanted to be more of like a web-based designer, like doing design, and that's what I started out thinking. And then in school got exposed to actual coding and I was like, holy shit, like I want to do this. Like I want to make things happen. And like once it kind of just happened, but if I didn't get exposed to that, maybe I never would have done that. It's so I think try to just get exposed to a lot of things, learn as much as you can from your peers, ask questions, be curious and just continually be learning and figuring things out.
Oh, that's awesome. At what point do you think junior software engineers could get promoted to become senior devs?
Yeah, every company's different. I mean, to me, this kind of gets back to my kind of comment I made earlier about like, I don't believe it's years of experience. Some companies will likely have that. Um, to me, I think it's more gets back to if I wanted to like put a like definition to it is it's kind of like how you operate as an engineer and like the influence and impact that you're having. And it's really, really like blurry what I'm trying to describe because it's not like a checkbox where it's like, oh, you had 2 years of experience, now you're mid-level. Oh, 5 years, now you're senior or 10 or what. I like that would be really easy, but I don't believe it's a number of years because I've seen engineers with 2 years of experience that are act and produce work that's more senior than like someone with 10 years. So it's
Wow.
not to like it to me, it's not necessarily years of experience. It's kind of the depth that you have and how you operate. But like I said, some companies literally will have, check boxes in order to, maybe it is years of experience before you can become a senior. Maybe it's certain projects that you're having to do in order to become that. And that kind of gets to my point of the type of impact and work that you're doing. This one's really hard to like because it just really depends on companies and how they think about it.
Yeah, but in a more general, in a more general way, if a junior developer should walk up to you and say, "Hey, Ryan, can you give me advice on how I can become a senior dev as quickly as possible?" You know, like
Yeah.
what advice would you give to them?
First off, it's you got to have experience. That's an easy one. Like that is one stipulation to it. Like if I'm like typically Netflix hires senior engineers, and so when people come to me and they're like, "Oh, I'm fresh out of school," or like I'm just looking for that first opportunity, I'm probably not going to hire them. Like it's just like that because we hire senior. I'm looking for someone with years of experience. So maybe it is 2 years. Like it depends, like really on how they show up in the interview and things like that. But it's easy for me to say like, well, I need some sort of real world experience. If you want to get it quickly, I don't know if there's an easy way around it. I think it's like keep learning and just owning what you're doing and try not to focus to be honest, try not to focus too much on the title. I mean, it feels good to be called like something bigger and better, but it really at the end of the day, it doesn't matter as long as you're like enjoy what you're doing and producing great work, like titles and things like that will come. And I think I'm sure I've been guilty of this, but we get super hung up on titles and worrying about that when at the end of the day, I'd probably not worry so much. Just continue working at what you're doing and growing and not try to take like the fastest path there. Nothing changes. You're still doing the similar work like you are.
That's true. It's just the title and maybe the salary that changes, but nothing else changes for real.
Yeah, I mean, let's not be, salary is not a bad thing to get more money for sure. Like I get it. But yeah, I mean, it takes time. It doesn't just happen overnight.
Yeah, that's true. So we're now at the point of aspiring software engineers, and I know we've asked a couple of questions, so I'd like to continue from there. Next question would be: I know you've also said something like this, like, "Oh, this question is going to come next," and it's I don't know how to answer it. It's a more general question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. What is the job of a senior software engineer?
Yeah. I like the question. It's, there again, yes, depends, but I think like even like thinking throughout my career and like what started to change from as I moved maybe more from mid to like more of a senior role. The funny thing is I feel like you're sometimes it feels like you're almost coding less. Maybe because like you might be doing more like mentoring or more like high level architecture, thoughtful like designs and like, you know, proposals that you're like, we should, invest in this area and here's how we should approach it. So I found myself like the more senior I got, I was like I still would be coding it, but there was a lot more like planning and architecture and different things that you were doing and conversations that you were having with other engineers or like within your team, but even maybe with other cross-functional engineering teams, like figuring out like how do we solve this problem that we're trying to do, and bringing people along that journey. So like I think the funny way to describe it is like I felt like as I got more senior, it was like less coding, maybe more meetings, maybe more like high level like planning that was happening. But I mean, at the end of the day, you're still likely producing features, or, if it's, I always say features, I'm like, get too hung up on like product, but I used to be working in like agencies, and so I would work with clients to build certain things, or so I think you're still doing that. You're still doing all the building, and day-to-day work is coding, but I think you kind of gain more of these other things that you're doing too, and things like communication becomes more important, like how you write documentation or how you communicate verbally to the rest of your team, or in like a document memo type form of like how you're describing things in like technical architecture. Those are kind of skills that start to get built up more.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work.
It's fun though. It's like, and it kind of naturally just happens too, right? Like it's like I look back on it and I'm like, yeah, it's just like I think like my like time coding almost went down like over time.
Yeah, you're right. Um, what is the, because I don't know any misconception about senior developers, but if there are any misconceptions about them, would you like to talk about them?
I mean, I'm sure there are some. I'm trying to think of any like off the top of my head. Oh, I mean, like I feel like there again, like you can easily like say like junior could look up to senior and say, "Oh, the senior person knows it all," or "They know this better than me." That's bullshit. They don't. Like, I mean, they might, but like they don't all. It doesn't like everyone knows different things, and I have absolutely learned from someone who is a lot more junior than me because they had some unique perspective or approach that I didn't know. And I think that, I guess, saying that like, oh, well, that senior person on my team is going to have all the answers. That I don't think that that's true. And it's like I think reminding yourself too is that if you were that junior person on the team, you are adding value and a different perspective. Even sometimes asking a question can be really change other people's way of thinking on it. And so I guess the misconception is sometimes people like more senior than you or higher title are going to know or have the right answer, and that's not always true.
Do you have any advice for senior software developers?
What in particular would I like? What kind of advice? Like, yeah, I guess like that's pretty broad questions, or like specifically, like,
Specifically, it could be like a couple of things that you see, a couple of common things you see that are not necessarily nice that you think they could improve on, or that you improved on while you were, senior software engineer.
yeah, I think like focusing on skills that are sometimes not really. I think, as engineers, we get so caught up on like even how we started this conversation of like, how do you learn to code and how do you, continue being like the best at coding, is I think the more senior you get too is thinking about building strengths in some of these other skills that I mentioned, like communication being a very, very big piece. I mean, not to say that like the most junior person can't be a strong communicator or focus on that. I just think it becomes more and more important the more senior you become. And so I think like focusing on that can be very useful. Um, Helping others. Like I think it's like we often forget like, okay, like yeah, I made it to the senior point, but like I had to take a journey in order to get there. Can I help others that are starting out, maybe on my team or in the industry? I think like giving back to me is always awesome. Like I think you also learn from doing it too, which is a good thing. Another thing that often comes up that you didn't, that wasn't really part of the question, but like is career growth. I think people are like, what do I do next as a senior engineer? I want to keep growing, and what does that look like? And I think like people often feel that the next step is management, and I do not, I want to say that that is like not a step up. It's like a step down in ways. Like it's a different role, and you kind of are like moving into management is like starting over. You're in a different role. Yes, you're talking and being technical, and talking with engineers and working with them, but you're dealing with people problems more than you are dealing with like technical problems. And so I think people naturally think that that's like the next step. And it might be for some people, don't get me wrong. But I've also seen it where people continue being just strong engineers and like maybe they move into like staff or principal or architect level, or they're just having a broader impact on the work that's being done. Don't stop going down that path. Like just because you think management or directors and all those types of titles are the right way to go, they're not for everyone. I will just say that.
Wow, I love the way you concluded that question because you answered my last, question on the series of, senior software engineers. Like, where did they go next from there? Awesome, really awesome. The next questions I'd like to ask will just be fun questions. That just trivial questions I would just like to, know more about from you. But so far, so good. Brian has been able to answer all the questions from code newbie to junior software engineer, senior software engineer, and what you need to do next from there. So thank you, Ryan, for answering all the questions. However, like I said, I want to ask you, a couple of like personal questions, like you know, why did you get started in tech in the first place? In terms of what inspired you, to get started in tech.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Funny enough, like I mentioned earlier too, is that like I thought design was my focus at first, and I grew up like drawing as a kid. I love art, and I did a ton of like graffiti, large murals, things like that, and so I was like, uh, I want to do something off of like art and design, and so there was things like graphic design where it was like, oh yeah, that's cool and stuff, but there's this like web design type focus, and that was intriguing because it was fairly new and exciting, and so I started to kind of travel down that road. I almost took a tattoo apprenticeship where I was actually a tattoo shop that where I lived offered me an apprenticeship. I'm glad I didn't do that and went down the technology path instead.
Wow. Can you remember your first line of code? What date, or like when, what year? Not necessarily the date, and what language it was.
Oh, it was probably in the late 90s, and it would have been HTML. It probably would have been something in like Angel Fire or GeoCities, like where it was just like this is before MySpace, but like I know a lot of people that's their early start was like just manipulating like a MySpace page. It was similar to that. Like that's what's probably my first line. I don't even know the first like the year or what it would have been, but that's the kind of painting picture of where it was at.
Wow. I was born in 98, so I guess you've been coding for as long
Oh,
as
you're
I've known.
dating me, man. Oh man. Yeah, it was probably around 98 that I did that.
Crazy. Wow. That's really wow, you're like someone's godfather in code right now. You've been coding for as long as I've been alive. Wow. Awesome, man. Really awesome. Next question will be what were you doing before you got into software engineering?
Um, I mean, I kind of dove into it like right after, not right after high school. I kind of was trying to figure out what I was doing. Maybe took like I think I took a that quote unquote gap year, which I've heard people say, but like where I just did like you know, I worked at like a auto body shop, like working on cars for a year while I decided like what I wanted to actually go into school for. But that, nothing else. Like it wasn't like I did like investment banking and then moved into software engineering. It was like that was kind of one of the first things I went to.
Cool. Did you find learning to code easy when you first began?
No, and I mean, I still don't. Like, I think it's like, it was such a foreign concept, but the thing is I think what I've still to this date found, I mean, it's so frustrating, so frustrating at times. And then there's like exciting when something works, like that moment I don't care how long you've spent on it, when something works, you're just like, yes, like it feels so good. I still get joy in that. But I remember when I first started, like it was just like so exciting that you like got something to work. It was just like that feeling with like always, I kind of felt like throughout my career, I still kind of stuck around. It's probably not as exciting now as I've done it longer, but I know the first like little few times, like you manipulate even just some HTML and you're like, holy shit, this is live. Like people can see this. That's cool. Like I think that that was a big driver. But it wasn't easy. That's for sure.
What are some of your career goals for your future for the future? I'm not sure you'd like to share that, but if you'd like to, maybe tell us one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I should probably be more thoughtful on on my own. I feel like I hold my team accountable more and like want to make sure that I'm thinking about their growth paths and stuff that I oftentimes I'm like I should probably be putting myself through that more. And to be honest, my manager, she is amazing at holding me accountable for that. But I've thought about like I want to continue down the management side of things. I love dealing with like the people challenges, hiring, growing teams. And so that in which is like, okay, well, what can I do that's a little differently? And I think like over time, like I've taken on more, and I think so my impact is bigger where I'm taking on maybe larger teams or larger initiatives that we're doing, and that to me continues to challenge me and that and grow. Like I learn from it and figure those types of things out. So I want to continue down that path. Do I want to go all the way to like a large like VP role or something? That's still like open for me. I'm like, I don't know. And maybe eventually I just do something altogether where I'm like, don't even, focus on being in tech. I don't know, but that's kind of where my head's at when I'm thinking about it.
That's dope. Who's someone you look up to on tech Twitter?
Oh man, there's just so many people. I feel like I don't even know where to start. There's so many amazing people that like that I follow that I've followed for years that have either that I've met in person and that they've influenced something I've done. There's people that I've even worked with who may not even be on Twitter that are so influential. I think it'd be too hard for me to pick one. But I think like I go back to like Twitter's an amazing resource. There's a lot of like garbage out there, but there's a lot of amazing people that you can learn from and just get different perspectives on.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I see a lot of awesome people joining this chat right now. I don't want to name no names because I can't name everyone here, but everyone here, you guys are really awesome, and you guys are really cool. Uh, would you say there's any difference between coder, developer, engineer? Those terminologies, are there really any difference?
Coder, engineer, like you're asking what the difference are, or
Yeah, like technically, are there differences?
I don't think so. Like I think you can label there are like in which that like thinking of software engineering or development, coding, whatever you're doing, everyone's doing something a little bit different, right? Like there are different roles that kind of play into that, but like if you're like I'm a coder and I'm like I'm an engineer, I don't know like what's the difference? Like we'd have to like I don't think the title describes it. Either there's differences or that they're the same. It's like you kind of have to pull apart like what does that person actually do? But like I think I had said earlier, like the people what's a engineer? Is there a difference between engineer, developer, software engineer, front end engineer? Like like there you can use a term multiple times. Like UI and front end are to me pretty interchangeable. So I don't think there's a huge difference.
Awesome. Have you tried mobile dev, backend, desktop, game dev,
Yeah, like you're
DevOps?
you're putting all like that's the thing is like but those are a little more self-explanatory. It's like if you say mobile, I'm like, okay, well you work on mobile. But you could still go deeper on like iOS, Android. Are you doing Flutter? Are you doing React Native? Like, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
it's really hard. There's so many terms that like and you can start to kind of go narrow it down.
yeah. Thank you very much, Brian, for um, being my guest on this Twitter Space chat. We've really learned a lot, and really want to thank you for showing up. And
Well,
thank you, everyone else, for listening.
yeah, no, thanks so much for having me. I hope people found it interesting, useful, even take away something small from it, or disagree with me on something too. That's always good too, to let me know.
Okay, so Ryan, where can people connect with you, and what's something you like to share? I
I
think
mean,
Scott, let's plug.
yeah, Twitter's always great. You can find me on here. and I'm fairly active. I don't know. Some people may know that I host a podcast called Front End Happy Hour. We talk a lot about these topics, whether it be it's not just front end, it's like career and we back end, front end, just a varying degree of topics that we like to cover. Yeah, those are two sources that are fairly good. You can find me on LinkedIn, things like that too. Instagram, who knows?
Folks, if you don't listen to front end happy hour, I think you guys are missing out because I listen to it like almost every day, and it's become one of my favorite podcasts right now. It's really really dope. You guys should give it a check out, and you can also follow Ryan on Twitter, and because we might get to talk more in the future and collaborate more. Thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful evening if you're in Nigeria. Have a wonderful morning slash afternoon wherever else you are in the world. Have a great day. Ryan, take care.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.